Since we'll be doing quite a bit of reference to outside sources for our first essay, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes today doing an in-detail look at the QPS, or quotation paraphrase summarize method. That way we understand how it can be used to get the most out of our quotations from outside, and also to make sure that a reader sees why it is that we've quoted everything we have. As a little review from last week, you'll remember that there are only two reasons for us to include outside writing in our own. Any outside writing we include in our own writing must be doing one of two things: either giving shape to our ideas or helping us to support our ideas. Now, in this case, we're using outside writing to give shape to our analysis of plagiarism across cultures. We're using outside writing in order to get access to our theoretical framework, and that's something else that we discussed last week. In this case, one of the most important pieces of our theoretical framework is cultural relativism, and we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to go into the document that we get that idea from and get the writing necessary to help us to include that in our own writing and show why cultural relativism will be important to our analysis. So here we go. Now, writing, for all intents and purposes, exists in three parts, and I guess I should clarify, this is for the purposes of our QPS quotation integration method. Those three parts are the wording, structure, and underlying idea. Anytime we go to get writing from an outside source and include it in our own, it's that underlying idea that we're the most interested in. That means that we'll have to find a way of stripping away the original wording and structure to show how we get to that idea and the way that the idea comes from the original but also works for us. We're going to start by quoting, and I'm using the designation WSI here as a way of reminding us that the wording, structure, and underlying idea are all the same here because we're just taking the quote or direct wording from the original source. So, when we quote, we excerpt as much of the original source as is necessary for the idea we'll be using, but we don't necessarily need all of the writing in the original. And I'll show you what that means in just a second for the way that we excerpt our quotation. We also want to make sure that we're using a signal phrase to lead into the quoted material. I'm a fan of the good old-fashioned according to. So, according to the reading, cultural relativism, and I'm going to break here, you'll notice that I've got our square brackets, and inside there are three periods. The presence of those three periods tells the reader that I've left some amount of wording out that was originally in the original because it was necessary, but that I don't need for the purposes of the idea that I'm taking out of that original source. Now, it's three periods because that was only wording. It would be four periods if there were one or more full sentences being left out. To go back to the excerpt then, cultural relativism refers broadly to an intellectual stance that rejects the idea of an absolute viewpoint and the existence of objective criteria for making judgments about what is or what is not real or true. I've also included a citation here of, in this case, the page number because it was available. But if I was taking this off of, say, a web page, rather than the page number because that wouldn't be there, I would instead have to count the number of paragraphs down from the top and use that number instead. Now, that's step one. We take our quote. Step two is where we paraphrase. And here I've got the designation SI because we still have the original structure and idea here, but we'll be replacing the original words with our own. We reword the original quote as closely as possible and maintain the original structure, but there's an important thing here, and actually you should all have a pretty good understanding of this already because of the depth in which it's covered by the pieces that we've been reading. We can't stop here. If we stop here in the process without going on to the summarize stage, the quoted material is still mostly the original author's, and its inclusion would be patch writing plagiarism. We don't want that. It's kind of a gray area. Really, the thing that saves this from being plagiarism is if we go through the whole process. And as long as we've got that summary at the end, it becomes clear that this was just a stepping stone or a kind of a middle point. But if we leave it here, it really does look like actually the wording's still from that original author, and we haven't really done enough to integrate it into our own. That's bad. The paraphrase here goes like this. This generally means that there is no one best way to see things, and no one best single set of expectations for what we deem to be significant. If you really wanted to, you could actually draw lines directly to the individual phrases from the original. Again, all I've done is put it into my own wording and maybe simplify a couple things here and there, but structurally it's the same. Last, we get to our summarize stage, and here I've got the designation I because this is the stage in which we get to the idea, which is what we were pursuing all along. Here we summarize the original quote and, using our own wording and structure, show how that quote and the idea within it will be important to the writing that we'll be doing and the ideas that we'll be developing. So, the summary. What I take away from this is that when it comes to discussing plagiarism, there is no best way to decide if plagiarism has been committed because such judgments are subjective. Because they are subjective, we have to view them in the context of the writer's own history and cultural background. Now, just going from quote to paraphrase to summarize, all of these things seem to pretty logically come from one another, but say that we were to leave the paraphrase out and jump directly from quote to summarize, it would be difficult for a reader to see exactly how I was getting all of the parts of my summary from the quotation itself. The paraphrase stage in the middle, though, is what helps that reader to get from one to the next. It's a kind of a stepping stone or middle point. The same way that we couldn't stop at paraphrase, we also need to make sure that we've got the paraphrase there so that the transition from the original quote to the end summary is as clear as it can be. We don't really want our reader stopping and trying to figure out where we got our ideas from by the time we summarize. The very last thing we do is put it all together, and all I've done here is copy and paste the three parts together. There hasn't been any further rewriting or anything here. So, the final version. According to the reading, cultural relativism. Cultural relativism refers broadly to an intellectual stance that rejects the idea of an absolute viewpoint and the existence of an objective criteria for making judgments about what is or is not real or true. This generally means that there is no one best way to see things and no one best single set of expectations for what we deem to be significant. What I take away from this is that when it comes to discussing plagiarism, there is no best way to decide if plagiarism has been committed because such judgments are subjective. Because they are subjective, we have to view them in the context of the writer's own history and cultural background. I hope that having gone through this closer look at QPS, specifically using some of the concepts that our paper will use, you see exactly why it is that I am so emphatic about its usage. We really need to use this system so that it's clear where our ideas are coming from, so that it's clear exactly how we're getting from the original source to the final summary. And lastly, we want to be using this so that we've got a good way of taking the material necessary to tie our writing as closely as possible to the outside writing that either shapes it or gives it some sort of support.